Good afternoon. My name is Chris Lane. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Centre for Global Development. Welcome to this online CGD event. It's about excise taxes on tobacco, alcohol, sugar-sweetened beverages and fuel, and lessons from Chile. This event is part of a follow-up that CGD is doing to the 2019 report of the Task Force on Fiscal Policy for Health. And this report found that increases of taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and sugar-sweetened beverages could save millions of lives through the reduction of consumption of these products, while also leading to higher tax revenues. We will hear today from the IMF about a report they have done on these taxes in Chile. And Chile has an across-the-board above average consumption of these products, which are well-known health hazards. So really what we are trying to get at is what role do health taxes have to play in supporting revenue and improving health, including in this current context of COVID-19. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Claudio Agostini, who's Professor of Economics at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and he's also an advisor to the Chilean Minister of Finance. Then we have Amanda Glassman, who is the Executive Vice President at CGD, as well as a Senior Fellow at CGD. And from the IMF, we have Ruud de Mooij, who's an advisor in the Fiscal Affairs Department, and his colleague, Senior Economist, Roberto Chatan. So the run we'll have today is we'll first hear from Ruud and Roberto on their findings. We'll then have remarks from Claudio and from Amanda. We'll have a brief panel discussion, and then we open the floor to Q&A. If you have questions for our speakers, you can submit them by email to events@cgdev.org. You can tweet them to @cgdev, or you can submit comments via the YouTube stream. I'll get the comments and be able to relay them to the panelists. So, Ruud, Roberto, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I hope you can all hear me. So I'm sharing my screen. So thanks a lot. And thanks a lot also for the opportunity to be here today. We're going to talk about our work on excises in Chile. And this will be mainly presented by Roberto, who has done most of the work. But let me first put this work in a slightly broader context. So this is, and you see here to the left, the first page of the report that we did for Chile, which is joint work with the OECD on two topics. So one topic was an analysis of the tax expenditure methodology in Chile. And this was quite an extensive part of the exercise that we did with them. But the second part is more sort of a policy analysis of the excises in Chile, on which we will be talking today. So this report was finalized last October and presented for the minister, also later discussed with members from Congress. And Chile was a country that actually also published this report. So we do this type of reports more often for countries. But they're not always published. Sometimes they remain confidential for the government, but this one is published, so this is available for everyone to look at. Maybe also, as a matter of context, it's interesting to know that the IMF also does sort of more broader policy and analytical work related to excises. So we have done recently what we call a how-to note on tobacco excises, which really sort of is a hands-on guide for countries on the use of tobacco excises in their tax system. And we are currently doing a similar one on the taxation of sugar-sweetened beverages and more generally unhealthy foods. So we've also done a lot of work on fuel taxation and fuel subsidies, which is another sort of area of big concern, also related to health. And So you will see here today basically how that work trickles down to sort of the country level when we do a in-country assessment. So with that, I hand over to Roberto to present the work we did in Chile. Roberto?
Roberto, you may be muted.
Yes, I'm muting myself. Thank you, Ruud. Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to present this report, which is a rather long report full of details. So I'll try to summarize. The report assesses 4 excises: alcoholic beverages, sugary drinks, tobacco, and fuels, mostly motor vehicle, diesel, and gasoline. It looks at the structure of the taxes, but keeping an eye a watchful eye on revenue potential of each of these taxes, as we were requested by the Ministry of Finance to do. Now, the first surprising fact that we discovered is that Chile has an excessive consumption in all these excisable goods. It has a world championship consumption of these sin goods. Took me a little bit by surprise. In alcohol, for example, the annual consumption per capita is 9.3 liters of pure alcohol, compared to 6.4 of the world average, and 8 liters of pure alcohol in the American region. But this does not fully capture the problem, the drinking problem in Chile. There is a prevalence of heavy episodic drinking or binge drinking among the population age 15-19, so it's pretty high. The prevalence in Chile is 54% versus 46% in the world average, or 49% in the American region. It could be worse, of course. I mean, as an example, Ireland, the prevalence of HED in Ireland is over 71%, but still Chile is higher than the European average. That it's quite a feat. In tobacco is a similar problem. The prevalence of daily cigarette smoking in Chile is 32% of the population, which is only second to Serbia, and only by a marginal difference among almost 150 countries. And it's about 3 times the average for the American continent. So Chile has a serious tobacco addiction problem. Sugar, again, the consumption is high for international standards. The main concern here is obesity. Chile ranks particularly high in child overweight. It ranks 6th in the world. So Chile pioneered with the introduction of a sugary drink in response to that health hazard. And fuels, there's a short disproportionate consumption in the case of diesel, which I will discuss in more detail in a minute. So it is important to see excises in the dual role as effective revenue raisers because of inelastic demand, but also inducing a change in consumer behavior to reduce public health costs. So not just the externalities, but cost on which are costs on third parties, but internalities as well. That is the underestimation by consumers of the lifelong cost to themselves that caused by addiction. On the revenue side of the issue, an international comparison can give a rough idea of the space available for increasing revenues. Chile's revenue from excises is slightly above the mean in Latin America, 1.5% of GDP versus 1.2% of GDP for all excises, but is 1 percentage point down from the OECD average. So this aggregate numbers convey a sense that there is some room for raising revenue, but realistically not of the order that would make a radical difference in the overall picture in Chile. No? Issues are different in each excise, but the greatest opportunity for enhancing revenue is in fuels. That's where the biggest deficit as compared to the OECD is. And the report assesses different scenarios for fuel tax and and estimates the revenue for each scenario. Next slide, please. I'll go into discuss fuels for a few minutes now. So the starting point of the analysis is to benchmark the existing fuel taxes to the level required to compensate externalities, emissions, congestion, accidents, road erosion. Fortunately, the calculation has already been made by a colleague at the IMF, our own Ian Parry, and have been recently updated for corrective taxes on motor vehicle fuels in Chile. And the main message is that Chilean motor fuel taxes are economically very inefficient, especially in the case of diesel. To reach efficiency, in the case of gasoline, the tax will need to increase by 80%. But the case is much worse for diesel, since the statutory excise is just 1/4 of gasoline, despite that they're about equally pollutant, both of them. So in order to reach the efficiency level, as measured by Ian Parry, the diesel tax would have to increase about 6-fold. So the first remarkable fact is that the very low tax rate on diesel. That's part of the current structure of the tax on fuels in Chile. But moreover, to complicate matters a little more, the tax on diesel applies depending on the final use of the fuel. Indeed, some uses are partially or fully exempt. The way it works is that the tax is creditable against VAT at different rates. For industrial or stationary use, there is 100% credit, so they're basically exempt. That's called the general credit for diesel. Trucking companies get a tax credit varying from 31 to 80% of the tax, depending on the size of the trucking company. The average credit is 53%. Passenger transport get 0 credit, so they're the only ones fully taxed. So the second finding is that the low excise on diesel is lowered further by crediting the tax in a way which adds perverse incentives like splitting companies to fall under the threshold, and administrative complications like tracing the end use of diesel and controlling for mixed use of the fuel, like construction companies, for example. On top of that, the excise is not included in the base of VAT, which is an unusual tax design feature, but common in Chile, except for tobacco, which amounts to a triple benefit, reducing total tax burden on diesel, which may explain the table that I present there, that the consumption of diesel in Chile is way above the average in the rest of Latin America. It's 9.2 barrels per 1,000 population, compared to around 5% the average in the region. The same difference does not exist for gasoline, by the way. And here there is a policy issue, a policy question regarding how we understand the credit for the excise granted for some users of diesel. For the transport companies, is considered a tax expenditure, but the general credit for stationary user is not considered a tax expenditure. It's not calculated. It's not considering the budget of tax expenditures. And there is really no good available explanation for the different treatment, because in general, the method followed in order to calculate tax expenditure is that there are any deviations from the general tax regime, and this credit would be a deviation from the general tax regime. And the report talks a little about this because the first section of the report is on tax expenditure, so there is a discussion on this here. But we should point out that since 2017, Chile adopted a special green tax on stationary emissions of $5 per for CO2, for each CO2 ton. And we have to see that the externalities of stationary fuel consumption is lower than motor vehicle fuel. So there could be an argument that each should be taxed differently. However, we have to point out that the green tax in Chile is still very low. The $5 per ton of carbon emission is low compared to the average target around $75 for carbon emission ton. The next slide, please. So the report estimates the revenue impact of 4 possible measures to improve the design of fuel taxes in Chile. One is eliminating the credit for the excise of motor vehicle diesel, including excises in the base of the VAT on fuels, increasing the excise on motor vehicle diesel to equal the excise on gasoline, and increasing excises to the point where fuel prices reach their efficiency level. Those are the 4 big options. And as you can see in the table, raising excises to the corrective level would bring in 1.5% of revenue of GDP, taking into account the elasticity, the corresponding elasticity as measured by Ian Perry. So this is a big ticket item, and this is placed here just as to picture what the different options are. Of course, doing all this at once might not be in the books, no? But this gives a picture of what the options are and how much revenue they would bring in the medium term. So the next slide now, we go to alcohol now. The current tax on alcohol is an ad valorem, a rate for beer and wine of 20.5%, and another one for liquor at 31.5%. Again, they're not in the base of the VAT. And the social cost of alcohol consumption has been estimated $2.2 billion for 2017, over 6 times the excise revenue. There are no available estimates on externalities, on pure externalities. So we looked at some guidance from international practice, but the comparison is not easy because there is a very large variation in both the structure and the level of alcohol taxation around the world. Taxes differ depending on the type of drink, beer, wine, liquor. They all have their own ways of being taxed. But more problematic is that countries have a variety of combination for of taxation. While they have a specific content of pure alcohol, an ad valorem, or even unitary taxes per volume of beverages. And only a few countries have ad valorem only, aside from Chile. There are cases of Mexico, Korea, Australia, and all have higher ad valorem than Chile has. But the comparison becomes very difficult unless one converts the ad valorem into specific taxes or vice versa. We did that experiment for a sample of popular Chilean beers and wines at different price levels in order to have a sense of how Chile compares. But then we found that in the Journal of Wine Economics that I was surprised to find that it existed, but there is a Journal of Wine Economics on that in Anderson 2020 normalizes the excises for 42 countries for the same price level for a single beverage at a uniform price, so that the comparison can be done. And in all 3 cases, beer, wine, and liquor, Chile is below the mean. If that is a meaningful comparison, because the dispersion is very high. But the case can be made that in the case of liquor, Chile is way below the average. It's less than 50% than the average tax on liquor. So there could be an argument to increase the rate of tax in liquor, but not not so clear in the other two. And the revenue impact of raising rates on beer and wine are more uncertain, given that the demand only modestly inelastic, according to studies that we reviewed. So the main issue with alcohol excise in Chile is the structure of the tax, not so much the revenue. Although, as I said, there is some room in liquor taxation. From a public health perspective, an ad valorem excise is not the most appropriate tax, as we know, because it leads producers to reduce the quality of the product, but not the quantity of alcohol delivered. Thus, an ad valorem is less effective in discouraging alcohol consumption and in reducing its social cost, though it may be better in protecting the revenue. So one possible remedy to the social cost of alcohol consumption in Chile is to change the structure of the tax, introducing a specific tax and replacing, at least partially, the ad valorem, or more specifically, to introduce a specific tax to act as a floor to the current ad valorem, which would increase the price of cheap alcohol in absolute and relative terms. And of course, we also recommend to include the excise in the base of the VAT. Those are the main recommendations for alcohol. For tobacco, the health costs attributable to tobacco consumption are high. They represent about 11% total cost of the Chilean health system, a proportion well above the main economies of Latin America. Here again, there is no estimation of the externalities that we could use for our analysis. But it's noteworthy that Chile has one of the highest tax burdens on tobacco, which represents 82% of the retail price, compared to 62% in America and 77% in Europe. And the tax revenue ranks closely to the average internationally, that is 0.5% of GDP, which is relatively poor given the high consumption and the high tax burden simultaneously. But while still the revenue has declined proportionally with respect to other revenues, despite rate increases recently, and has even decreased nominally since 2016. The nominal revenue for tobacco is less today than it was a few years ago in Chile. This is consistent with a study made by Claudio a few years back that placed the tax burden on tobacco in Chile very close to the top of the Laffer curve. One possibly important reason that may explain this is the growing illegal market, the importation of contraband cigarettes. Now, a recent study financed by a tobacco company, I have to say, we point out in the report that that's the case, finds that a fourth of the national market is illicit, if we believe that report. And that this has grown very fast in the last few years. Illicit consumption was about 4% in 2012. This is consistent, however, with the reported trend in confiscation of smuggled cigarettes made by Chilean customs, from 7 million packs in 2016 to 14 million packs in 2019. And this is also consistent with the high elasticity of demand for tobacco in Chile, that also Claudio estimates in the study a few years back, from -2 to -1.5%. So that's how we arrived to the conclusion that in tobacco there is not much room to increase rates, at least not for revenue purposes. And if there is an easy option to substitute for illegal cigarettes, public health objective won't be met either. Now, the structure of the tax, we compared it internationally, and it's kind of balanced. In Chile, it's 55% of the tax is specific, 45% is ad valorem. When in Latin America, it tends to be on average a little more in favor of the specific. In Europe, it's more in favor of the ad valorem as compared to Chile. So Chile is kind of midway in between Latin America and Europe. And the specific could be increased in order to discourage consumption and increase the price of the cheap cigarettes. But doesn't seem to be room for major changes in that respect. And Chile has been moving in the right direction since 2010, when it was the tax was 100% ad valorem. Now it's much more specific. But there is a concern that 100% specific tax may be regressive in its impact, and so that goes the other way in keeping the mixed proportion that they have today. So an argument in favor of specific tax is administrative, because imports may not be official, may not be included in the official price list, so not in the tax base. But in those cases, 100% specific tax could apply to cigarettes that are not in the list. So the main conclusions here are that there's not so much room to make significant change in the structure of taxes. Taking on the illicit market would seem to be the short-term priority. And one way of doing that is by raising penalties to contraband of goods subject to additional taxes. And also the novel nicotine products like e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products that currently are not taxed and are also a health hazard on their own right, though arguably, according to many, less than burning tobacco products, but they should also be taxed, and now they're not. So those are the main recommendations for tobacco. And to finalize, Chile on sugary drinks. Chile was a pioneer in introducing the tax on sugary drinks in 2014. It is an ad valorem of 18% on beverages with a content of sugar above a certain minimum. And the revenue is modest, it's only 0.07% of GDP. Many countries have followed suit since then, and there are a variety of approaches of ad valorem, flat tax irrespective of the amount of sugar content, a specific tax amount of fluid, like in Mexico, it's 1 peso per liter. So there are various approaches here. There is not a uniform best practice.
Roberto, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up. We have quite a hard time deadline here. If you have like 1 minute.
Yeah, so here, I'll wrap up in 1 minute. Here we have a study that was mandated by the Chilean Senate for calculating the Peruvian tax on sugar consumption, and that's 1.9 pesos per gram. And the main recommendation here is to adopt that tax, but not only for sugary drinks, but for all sugar intake, because otherwise the tax does not work very effectively. If it is only on sugary drinks, there is a large substitution from drinks to junk food, and people just simply substitute the origin of their sugar intake. So that's the main recommendation for sugary drinks. There are more things to say, but in conclusion, the problematic for each tax is different. One is fuels is increasing rates, eliminating benefits or credits. Tobacco is taxing novel tax products and strengthening administrative controls. Alcohol is to change the structure, introducing specific floor tax, and sugar drinks is changed to specific tax economic efficiency level to all sugar intake. those are the main conclusions of the study. Thank you very much, and sorry that I took a bit too long for this presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Roberto, and also thank you, Ruud. I think we should go straight on to Claudio, who's talking to us from Santiago. Claudio, over to you. Don't forget to unmute, Claudio.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks for the opportunity to address the Excise chapter on the technical report and provide some few remarks with a view from the Ministry of Finance. So first, I would like to just address and put in context the goal of the study. This was requested by the Minister of Finance, and the goal was twofold, was to, on the one hand, assess tax expenditures, which ones were tax expenditures, which ones were not, how to measure them. And then the second goal was to address the corrective taxes in Chile and discuss if the tax base for those taxes was correct and if the level of the tax was the optimal one or not. That was the two main goals. And the context of this was as there was a tax reform in January 2020. The Minister of Finance reached an agreement with the Finance Commission in the Senate, and they agreed on having a technical, political and technical tax commission that would look at the tax system in Chile over 2020. And one main input for that analysis would be this report that was requested to the IMF and the OECD. And then the general view behind this, and that this is the view of the Minister of Finance personally, but that was shared with the Congress, was that when you compare the tax burden of Chile, it's around 21% of GDP, and compared to OECD countries controlling for Social Security, that puts Chile around 5% points below that average. And so the view is that Chile should move to close that gap over time, conditional on GDP per capita increasing over that period of time. So the minister asked for having a kind of roadmap that would lead to closing that gap as long as the GDP is increasing. And on top of that, there's currently some pressure on generating additional tax revenue. Fiscal deficit has increased, as you might have suspected. Public debt has almost doubled this year. So there's some pressure on getting additional tax revenue that is beyond this tax gap that was the original purpose of this analysis. Okay, so that's in terms of the context. And it's relevant for implementation. So I'm going back to that in a minute. So in terms of the main IMF-OECD recommendations that Ruud and Roberto just discussed and summarized, in general, they're quite aligned with the view of government authorities, and they are aligned in several ways. One, in terms of setting taxes, the optimal taxes for this purpose of correcting negative externalities. That's sort of the right way of look at this. These type of taxes are corrective taxes, and they should be calculated in terms of what is the optimal level to get rid of the negative externality, internalities too, but that's sort of the main goal, the way to look at them, and that's not the way that Congress usually looks at them. So that's sort of a first step that is helpful for the public discussion in Chile, and the Ministry of Finance agrees with that. Second, given this need for getting more tax revenue, and the fact that, as it was just described by Roberto, Chile has tax rates that in general are lower than the optimal, particularly in the cases of fuels, alcohol, and sugar, then this might be a silver bullet at this moment in time, in the sense that it will increase tax revenue, which is something that is needed. And at the same time, we're improving the efficiency and the allocation of resources in the economy. And third, this is complementary to a view that the Ministry of Health in Chile has been discussing for a while, regardless of the revenue need, that is, that we should push as a country to use taxes as an additional and complementary tool to improve the health of the population. The Health Ministry has been quite active over the last few years in terms of placing restrictions on where you can place ads on cigarette or alcohol, where it can be consumed, far away from schools, not in restaurants, many of these type of restrictions. That's sort of the main tool that has been used. And the last one was putting labels informing consumers on the types of food that were really high in terms of sugar content or sodium content. So on top of all of those measures, public health authorities have been pushing for the use of taxes, and this report is quite aligned with that discussion. And finally, to finalize my remarks and gives time to discussion and with Amanda's remark, in terms of implementation, so looking at the future, I mean, what can happen after this report has made public? First, it helps the discussion in Chile and in particular in Congress, because the IMF reports provides a report that's very technical and it's completely independent. You know, it's independent of the government and it's independent for the main actors in Chile. So that helps in terms of sort of providing confidence on the numbers and the methodology. But still, and this, my view is that this is the most difficult thing in Chile. Pressure groups have been quite active. That's true everywhere. But here they have been quite successful in the past, many times. Every single time that there have been some attempts to increase taxes on alcohol, the Pisco producers have been able to block that increase. Every single time that have been discussions on increasing diesel taxes, truckers have been not only very active and successful in blocking them, but they are literally blocking roads and highways, and they have prevented that from happening. And the same experience has occurred also with the approval of not tax reforms, of tax changes, but on these limitations I just mentioned that were pushed by the Ministry of Health in terms of where cigarettes can be consumed, where ads on cigarettes or alcohol can be placed, and even on just placing labels informing about high sugar or high sodium contents on food. However, in those cases, even though there was a long discussion in Congress and these pressure groups tried to block those reforms, finally there was some level of agreement to move them forward, and actually some of these reforms were at least partially approved, as opposed to the taxes on alcohol and the taxes on diesel. So, and this is my last remark, my view, and probably my hope, that more than my view, is that the COVID-19 crisis can help this time. And the reason is that many of the same pressure groups have been pushing the government to provide relief and subsidies to help deal with the economic impact on their activities. And of course, you need more revenue to actually be able to do that. And the response of the minister so far has been, well, if you want help from the government and we need more revenue, the first candidate for this revenue are tax exemptions, special tax treatments, and corrective taxes that are below the optimal. So the Ministry of Finance announced a couple of weeks ago that the government is planning on sending a tax reform to Congress sometime around mid-year to try to increase revenue through increasing corrective taxes and getting rid of some tax exemptions. So hopefully the COVID-19 can help this time and prevent the blocking of some pressure groups. Those are my general remarks. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I think people will be closely watching the progress of the legislation that you mentioned. Let me now pass to Amanda Glassman from CGD.
Hi, thanks. And thanks to all of the panelists for a great set of talks. So as Claudio was mentioning, we're in the middle of a terrible health crisis, and it actually is affecting people who live with non-communicable diseases, in part caused by some of the consumption of the products that we're talking about today. They are worse off, they face higher mortality rates, et cetera. But we're not only in the midst of a terrible health crisis, we're also in the midst of a terrible public finance crunch. We know that revenues in low middle income countries are not expected to recover quickly. Commodity prices, external demand, travel and tourism, all of those will remain below 2019 levels until at least 2023. So that's a huge pressure. And as Claudio says, it's a unique opportunity really to take some of these corrective measures and to use the leverage that comes with providing an enormous amount of economic relief to make some of these more difficult political changes. And we know that placing these corrective health taxes helps with reduction of consumption, saving lives, and reducing the costs in the first place that we're seeking to address. And work by the IMF and the World Bank previously has urged countries to correctly price polluting fuels through tax measures to account for their effects on health and the climate. And what we really like about this Chile work is that it extends that thinking on fuel to these other products that are also health harming: tobacco, alcohol, and sugary sweetened beverages. And it looks at them in the same place, which I also think is a good way to go. And I guess that we saw the IMF managing director, we saw the head of fiscal affairs speaking about the importance on the blog and elsewhere about the importance of corrective taxes on fuel consumption. And we would hope to see this full set of health taxes included in that kind of discussion going forward, and in the work that the IMF and the World Bank do with countries in this space. And I think the second part that's interesting about it is that it's a unique effort, at least in the public domain, to compare the health and social costs associated with consumption with the amount of current excises. And that way it identifies the shortfall that's needed for an optimal corrective tax, one where the product price is reflecting the total economic and social cost of consumption. Now I'm going to share a slide that my colleagues and I have. Let's see if I can do it. Always a challenge. Where's the share screen? Isn't that always the case that one is not able to share one screen? If Bryn, maybe you could put up the slide, or I can just narrate it. I think the bottom line is Roberto showed us that the corrective level of taxation for fuel was about 1.5 percentage points of GDP. But if you look at the report's recommendations on alcohol, tobacco, and sugary sweetened beverages, the corrective level of taxes would reach about 1% of GDP. So if we were to take the level of taxation suggested by the costs that are being concerned. And so I know that the report goes into these issues about whether we've exceeded, we're at the top of the Laffer curve, and therefore there would not be many more revenues to be had, and the problem of illicit trade being one reason not to increase cigarette excises. But I think what we can say is that if we looked at it in the same way that we look at fuel, we might be a bit more aggressive in terms of the levels of taxation, because ultimately our goal here is to get the public health effect as well, right? To reduce the consumption. In Chile, which is, as Roberto also pointed out, the second highest tobacco consumer globally, which is not a good place to be. I think the other thing I'd like to pose to our co-panelists is sort of what is it that here's the picture really that shows the costs associated with consumption of tobacco, alcohol, and sugar, and the size of the excises in contrast, and the space to meet that shortfall in corrective health taxes if we were to take the same approach that we do with fuel. I guess I'd like to ask questions back to our panel, and I know that Chris will help us do this. Ruud mentioned the how-to notes on tobacco, alcohol, and on sugar-sweetened beverages and tobacco. I guess one question is, you know, in the IMF hierarchy of guidance, there's also the coveted policy paper. You know, could we imagine a policy paper that next level above how-to that would acknowledge the macro criticality of tax increases from these sources, and that would treat it the same way we're treating fuel, with the same level of seriousness? I say a second question is, and I know that there are, Ruud also mentioned to us before we started that there are many technical assistance reports, but these are confidential, that do look at the levels of excises. I think it's great to put them in the public domain, because that gives us all an opportunity to weigh in from the peanut gallery, and hopefully to strengthen the analysis and bring the literature that doesn't always come. There's of course the Journal of Wine Economics, but there's also the world of health journals and health economics journals that may be useful as well when we're thinking about how to quantify these costs rigorously. And then, you know, is there space to expand the use of these in financial programs? Some work by Chris and colleagues is finding that, you know, it is very common to find adjustments to tobacco excises and other kinds of excises in IMF programs, but we don't always see that the structure or the amount of the, the affordability element of this argument is adequately treated. So, you know, is there space to improve our technical assistance there? So I'll stop there. We have other ideas about ways that we'd like to see the IMF and the World Bank push this forward further, but I'd love to hear from our colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Good. I think you do very well in kicking off the questions. I think it's only fair for me to go back first to Ruud, and then perhaps to Claudio, and then we will be able to take some questions we've had online. We only have about 10 minutes left. Maybe I could just add my own question, which is sort of pinging off Claudio. Is there a way in which we can package health taxes with the COVID response? I guess that's my. Are there other countries apart from Chile that are, you know, contemplating moving in 2021 in this direction? Sorry, I spoke for too long myself. Ruud.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks Amanda and Claudio for a very nice discussion already. Let me respond to some of the issues, in particular that Amanda raised in terms of sort of the work that the IMF does in this area. I think it's getting more attention, sort of the health angle to this, and I think COVID only makes that more important. We see that in our work, in our technical assistance work, which is always demand driven, that countries are very much interested in sort of the structure of their taxes and the role of taxes in achieving their health objectives. But this is basically an area where the interest of the Minister of Finance is aligned with those of the Ministry of Health, as also Claudio pointed out, up to a point, right? Roberto also referred to the Laffer curve. So the Minister of Finance is not interested to go beyond that point, but the Minister of Health may say, well, if pricing these products is so effective, maybe we should go even beyond that. So up to a point, there is sort of common interest, but at some point, the interest may start to diverge. And I think many countries have not reached that point, but at some point it may occur, of course. And I think these are interesting sort of angles. So combining the public finance perspective and the health perspective in looking at these various taxes. And for us, it is quite common to do this kind of work. When we go into a country, make a diagnostic assessment of their tax system, we typically look at the various taxes. Although I must say that the taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages and more generally unhealthy foods is somewhat more new. But that's why we have started to invest in this and doing this policy paper, which for us is the way to reveal sort of how the IMF is thinking about these issues, because most of these technical assistance reports remain sort of confidential, and we would like to see them more often published, to be honest, but that's not the preference of countries often. Whether this ultimately leads to a policy paper is also a matter of the demand by countries. You can imagine there's so many priorities for countries. There's these days a lot of demand for sort of our views on climate and on pricing of these externalities. But I can imagine that the interest in health is going to be so pervasive that this was also sort of leading maybe to demand for a more broader view of the IMF on this topic. So we've done a note on tobacco. We are now doing one on unhealthy foods. The missing link is still alcohol, which has its own, every sort of commodity has its own interesting features, right? Tobacco has more clear externalities, and the externalities related to alcohol are often more related to things like binge drinking. So modest consumption may not have that many externalities, but overconsumption is really sort of creating the largest external costs. And so this raises its own sort of issues in thinking about these issues. But I think the common framework for thinking about it is quite useful, I guess, in sort of helping governments design these policies going forward. So let me stop here and hand over to Claudio for.
Okay, thanks. In terms of putting a package of corrective taxes and COVID, my thinking will be the following. First, in the case of Chile, the constitution prevents from having earmark tax revenues. So you will need to change the constitution to allow anything of that sort. There's going to be a discussion on a new constitution next year, so this might happen. But currently, it goes against the constitution to have earmark tax revenues. That's of a first line. The second is that even if there were not such a constraint from the constitution, in general, the Ministry of Finance does not like to have earmark revenues, as it provides you less flexibility. And in addition, you can always somehow undone that from the other way. You can provide the revenue from corrective taxes for health purposes, and then you can reduce the budget of the health ministry from other sides. So it gives you less flexibility, and it's not even clear that you gain too much. So in terms of the Ministry of Finance doesn't like earmark revenue at all, besides the Constitution. So, however, having said that, I do think that the COVID crisis and the need for more revenue provides a political pressure in which this package looks good for approval. But this is just economic politics, more like political economy, sorry, more than anything else. In the sense that it's easier, I think, to go to Congress and say, you know, we cannot increase fiscal deficit more. We cannot increase public debt more. We actually need to pay it somehow in the future. We do need more revenue. And if you're asking for more relief, well, where will the money come from? And well, this is a natural candidate. And it's probably the best candidate for increasing revenue. You are not creating more distortions. You're reducing distortions. And if it's not this, what else? Are we going to increase corporate taxes even more when you need more employment and more investment? So I think that the sell of the package is better due to COVID, but not for any other issues.
Great, thank you very much, both. In terms of the questions we're getting online, a lot are focused on tobacco. And I think some people have read the report pretty carefully, and they're noting that you've got this very high smoking prevalence. You've still got a lot of ad valorem taxation in there, and that there are studies that show that the industry figures may be wrong on illicit trade. In fact, there's a paper by Guillermo Parege, Daniel Araya, and Jeff Drope from Illinois that suggests that the tobacco companies are substantially overestimating illicit trade. Maybe I can just go back to both of you, Claudio and Ruud, and then we will need to wrap up.
Thanks. So no, it's good to mention these other studies. So we definitely would be interested to have a look at them. As Roberto said, so some of these numbers were from the industry, which we always have to look at sort of from their own eyes, of course. But I think it's also consistent with other evidence that the illicit trade might have increased in Chile. For this mission, because it was remote, we have not been able to sort of speak with stakeholders in the country itself, which would have get us further insight in that. But I think this led to our conclusion that there is maybe an issue with the enforcement of the tax. And some of the evidence also from the customs pointed in that direction, that there is an issue that may also be important. And if you increase taxes and there is this leakage towards illicit trade, then it might ultimately not be in the interest, not of both for revenue and for the health objectives. So I think there is something to explore here. In terms of, I think that's on the tobacco. So yeah, let me stop here and give the floor to Claudio.
I would just add to what Ruud said, that the evidence, not academic evidence, but evidence that illicit trade of tobacco and cigarettes has increased does not come from the study of financed by the industry, of course. I'm not surprised that overestimates this, so doesn't tell me much. However, the report from customs from the Chilean IRS is that illicit trade has been increasing dramatically, especially in the two geographic free trade zones the country has. So that is, again, it's, if you want anecdotal evidence, it's not causal evidence, it's not academic evidence, but it's the enforcement agencies report that. If that is more or less than what the tobacco industry says, doesn't matter much. The thing is that it has been increasing anyway.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. I think we are just about out of time. I'm going to take the privilege of giving Amanda the last word before we sign off. Amanda.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to all the panelists. Just to say, we'll continue to be working on this issue and having conversations with all of you in the official and unofficial worlds on how we might move this idea of corrective taxes forward in an integral way, thinking about both fuel and tobacco, alcohol, and sugary-sweetened beverages together, so that there's kind of a consistent approach. And of course, looking at the possibly virtuous politics that are with us in terms of the COVID-19 crisis and the opportunity to reform inefficient taxation arrangements. So thanks to all of you. Good luck with your work. We know it's hard to do these reforms. I'm thinking that we should just we shouldn't subsidize diesel. We should subsidize transport firms instead. Of course, there's lots of things that one can do to manage the difficult political economy of these issues, but we wish you so much luck and thanks so much. Congratulations on a really interesting piece of work, and we'll watch the reform coming next year with interest. Thank you.
So thank you all. Thank you very much to all the online participants. I'm afraid I can't see you, which is a bit disappointing. I would love to have known who's out there, but thank you very much, Ruud, Roberto, Amanda, and Claudio for taking time out. And I know you must have a very busy time at this particular juncture. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you
so
very much.
A pleasure.